Hello everybody, I'm Jeremy Clarke. I'm Education Officer working for Medway Council in North Kent. I'm based at the Guildhall Museum in Rochester. I guess the first thing to say is that this is our starting point. We're new to this. We are still understanding the project as a whole. So this really is an introduction to the Guildhall Museum, but also for us, an introduction to linked conservation data itself. So who are we? Okay, we're funded by Medway Council, wholly funded by Medway Council, and that's significant for us. Medway Council is a young unitary authority. It was formed in 1998 from the northern part of Kent County Council, at that point, the council took on a large number of heritage attractions which had been previously managed by English Heritage. So a lot of changes about that time. What is Medway? Medway is two things really: a large conurbation of the original Medway towns, plus a significant rural area. Which is a peninsula of land that stretches out into the estuaries of the Thames and Medway. We are very much at the Guildhall Museum part of a wider heritage team. In fact, I think only one member of the team actually works solely at the Guildhall Museum. The rest of us work across a number of different sites. But as far as the museum is concerned, the collection has been around a while. It was founded in 1897, and when it was first opened to the public, it wasn't in the Guildhall itself, it was in another Rochester building, an Elizabethan house, which is still in the High Street and is now a visitor attraction in its own right. That was Eastgate House. It moved to the Guildhall in 1979, and since then, I guess, we members of staff have been working to stretch the collection to say more than, to be about more than just the history of Rochester, but to be about the area that is now managed by Medway Council. What is that history about? Well, there's the one major theme that is universally important to us is the history of transit and transition. And that's a matter of geography. Where we are in North Kent, basically our history begins and ends with the collision of a very, very old road and the longest river in Kent, which of course is the River Medway. So time and again, we find ourselves coming back to that theme, whether we're talking about prehistory or 19th century industry. We make about 90,000 or so visitors a year. That's a number which is in considerable flux at the moment, not just because of the lockdown, but also because a couple of years ago, the council found it necessary to shut one of our buildings, thereby removing about a quarter of our display space and a third of our storage space. So we're still really working our way out of that situation. And very importantly, we are free to enter, but also free to engage. We are lucky enough to be able to run a lot of our engagement activities free of charge. And that's been incredibly important for us as we've tried to remain progressive, to develop the service, especially in terms of tempting schools into doing new things, because we don't have to say, this will cost you so and so. How do we slice up education? There's lots of ways of doing it, of course. Rachel and I, as an education team, we tend to deal with the formal groups. It's not just about children. We work with all kinds of audiences, but they tend to come to us in groups which have already formed. So what we don't do is advertise events and allow people to turn up as individuals and families. We have other members of staff that do that. But no question, the schools market is incredibly important to us. And within that schools market, it's the primary age range that makes up most of the 10 to 12,000 children children we see every year. And that those children very much come from the local area, the Medway area. We are very much focused on those local primary schools, and that affects everything. That affects both what we teach, but also how we teach it, because we very much rely on our groups, generally speaking, coming to us to do specific things. They're not just on a day out, they're not just on a school trip, they're researching. And of course, it's very much object-based. We inevitably get put in the history pigeonhole, and that's totally understandable, but it begins and ends with objects for us. So we also teach quite a bit of science, especially for very young children, literacy and geography. Above all, we are live, directed, and responsive. In other words, although it's quite possible to do virtual education, and indeed we are getting into that as we speak, our kind of natural environment is to get out in front of audiences, to lead from the front, but to be responsive to the needs of our audience. So we usually have a target in mind, but we're trying, as we reach that target, to listen to what our audiences have to say, and to a certain extent, where they want to go. Now, of course, that what I'm describing here is our kind of best practice, but it's worth mentioning because when, for instance, Thanasis came to us and suggested we were part of the consortium, this is the kind of thing we always fall back on. I automatically start thinking, right, so where does this building block of our live, directed and responsive sessions, how can we get that in there? How's it going to work if that's the way we're going to interact with people? Okay, I love a mixed meta for me. So here you are, I'm bringing you into the room, but I'm also giving you the view from space. Now, what I mean by that is I want to characterize the way we work for you, but I am trying to describe it with big words, because I think if I do that, we've got more chance of finding those big words across the variety of different institutions who might be listening to this presentation. So we're more likely to get a match, which will be useful within our consortium. So if you're in the room, what you basically see is us talking to kids with old stuff. The view from space, what I think is going on there, a modelled participatory research task. One of the things I was particularly excited about when I first started looking into the linked conservation data project is it led me to the British Museum's research space site. And I found that interesting, applying the kind of individual research narratives that were being generated out of or through that website, thinking about what actually happens when I work with children in a classroom. So like a research task, what we're doing when we work with children and objects, we've got a target. I couldn't possibly communicate with teachers unless I had some idea of where we were heading. So this might be your research question, which could be all sorts of stuff. But along the way, just like a research task, you wander around. You know roughly the direction you're heading, but you have to accommodate things that crop up on the way. And certainly when you're working with an audience of young people, you do get things crop up which are interesting and creative and which you certainly want to follow before you draw everybody back to the question that you originally began with. What's missing, I think, and this is something that cropped up when I started to think about what we do in terms of research and documenting research, we're not so good, perhaps, at the data. And there's very good reasons for that. I think it is difficult to collect data when you're working with children. And I'm not just talking about the sort of the evaluative data, that are we any good, is what we're doing making any difference, but how we actually document the learning that is happening for each individual within a participatory group session like the one I've been describing. And that was highlighted for me in looking at linked data. And it might be something that we can kick around in discussion. It might be something that we ourselves can gain from being part of the linked data project. Okay, now what I've described so far is very much the kind of, as I said, the building block, the way we begin, especially when we're talking about that primary sector, which is very much our main constituency. But I think probably with the kind of subject matter that we're going to be discussing with linked data, we may well be looking at older students here. So I just wanted to emphasize that we certainly work with older students, and here I'm talking about 11 and upwards. Mainly for us, that's going to be secondary schools. But inevitably, we tend to work with them in a way that's different from the younger children. And it's the issue of numbers that we find particularly difficult. We just struggle to accommodate the whole year groups of 150, 180 students with all the logistical challenges in there, while preserving that best practice model I've been describing to you. So in other words, what I end up doing is usually two things. It's either what I've put there as a kind of storytelling. In other words, here is what you need to know about the first 1,000 years of Rochester's existence, bang through it in an exciting way as I can possibly manage, illustrating it with objects from the collection. And off they go, and then I get another 30 in, and off they go, and then I get another 30 in, and so on. So I do that quite a lot. The other thing we like to do with older students is work with special groups. Now, this is where we may be getting towards something that we would recommend if we were part of a continuing linked data project. This is what we might suggest. So we're talking about discussing with secondary schools about groups who, for all kinds of reasons, have either come off timetable, come out of the classroom, come out of school to do extra stuff or special stuff. So for instance, before the lockdown happened, we were nurturing a relationship with a creative writing group at Chatham Grammar School, who were interested in exploring the Dickens anniversary year and this year, and the publication of his final unfinished novel, and writing their own version of a Gothic story. So that's kind of ongoing. The one at the bottom there is perhaps our most developed project relating to a smaller group of special interest young people. Young Roots there, that's a Heritage Lottery Fund stream of money. We got a grant to work with a group of young people from Strood Academy, one of our local secondary schools. The thing about Young Roots is that it's designed for groups of young people outside school hours and outside the curriculum, which makes it particularly challenging. And we were able to work that by using a group who formed and came along to our sessions immediately after school. So it was like a school project out of school. And we worked with this group of young people over the course of about 18 months or so, looking at the building that you see there, which is one of our portfolio. It's a very interesting chamber block built by the Knights Templar in Strood. It's a very complicated building. It's a mixture of 17th century extensions and additions within a 13th century block that you see there. What I learned particularly about this project that I've taken forward is how important it was to these young people that they were engaged in a real task. And I think this is important for what we might think about for phase 3 of linked data. You see, what we did with them is we went to them and said, here is a really interesting building. It's not used enough. We think it's very difficult for people to understand, especially for young people to understand. Help us. Help us create some interpretation which is going to grab people and advocate for this building. And one of the things that they did is they said, You need to, it would be great if we could have some interactive digital resources on site for, to explain the building and humanize it. So we were lucky enough to work with Portsmouth University, who designed this character you see here, who is Brother Alan, who is a sergeant brother of the Order of the Knights of the Temple, and he welcomes visitors on site via an iPad, which they can pick up from a custodian, and he explains the site, he explains how it used to work in the medieval period, and you are then able to select a recreation of this chamber block you see here as it was when it was actually used in the 13th century. So we got great work out of the young people for that project, and a lot of it was because we were coming up with something that was actually going to be used in the real world. It was proper, it was real work. A quick word as I approach the end of this presentation, just to emphasize that here is something we do not have experience of, which is conservation. It's not entirely fair because conservation, of course, goes on, but it goes on in two ways, which I'm illustrating here. The first thing, when we have a big project, of course, we buy people in. So on the left there, you see our 1741 City of Rochester Newsham pump, being welcomed back to the museum by the Kent Fire Brigade, having been restored for us by another company, and it's now proudly on display inside the Guildhall itself. So there is conservation going on, we buy people in to do it. The other thing is, some of you may recognize, is a screen from AdLib. So we have a collections officer, or a curator if you like. He is doing, because of the pressure of work, the essential minimum steps that are necessary to secure the safety of our object. And in that little, the box there, description, he is creating a kind of, I suppose, a kind of conservation statement outlining very briefly the needs of the object and how it needs to be treated if it's going to be preserved. But that is the kind of level of our involvement in conservation in the Guildhall. So, looking forwards, as I said at the start, this is very much for us, definitely ground floor. But thinking of how we might be able to work together, focusing on the fact that Thanasis here is interested in looking towards getting funding for phase 3 of the project, which is going to happen next year. So how and what are we going to share about this project, which might bring in the wider audience that we need to get that funding? Now, the clue is, of course, in the name. And I've put that down for my own benefit as much as for everybody else, because when Thanasis first came to see us, I only heard that middle word. I only heard conservation. So I started getting very excited. Well, conservation is appealing. I got very excited about it, and I started thinking about all sorts of stuff that's going on. But I think that we are not going to be convincing to funders unless we get all three of those words in there. It needs to be about conservation, it needs to be about the data produced by conservators, and it needs to demonstrate why it's necessary to link that data. Right, so having looked at some of the presentations that the consortium did last year, there are clearly some challenges plus real advantages that we've got here. First thing is, with the data as it is now, we've got what I've described as a doubly specialized audience. So specialism number one is, of course, the conservator and the technical language that is inevitably involved in conservation. The thing about sharing conservation data is that data is additionally specialized because for the whole thing, the linking thing to work, the data has to be put in a form that is recognizable by computers. So we're talking about not just talking to conservators, we're talking about talking to conservators' computers, which makes it quite challenging to share the data with a wider audience as it is at the moment. And the second challenge for us, is definitely our lack of expertise in this area. But we got really big advantages. This consortium is full of institutions that have great stuff that people want to know about. And they want to know about it in detail. And the second thing is, I think we've got an opportunity here to give children and young people real tasks. I remember when we had the pre-meeting, we discussed about, I think it was from the National Archives, volunteers who were adding to, using knowledge graph schemes, adding to the information about the objects they were looking at. And I thought that was really appealing, and I think that's something we should remember and take forward to the following phase of this project. So, what am I suggesting? Now bear in mind, this is simply me punting something out here as a suggestion. I think rather than attempting to come head on to the data that we already have and try to explain to, for instance, a younger audience why this is important, we should actually try to design curation journeys, conservation narratives for groups of young people, so that they can do it themselves, appreciate why it's important. And because we've got a consortium here, if we do it in a number of different locations, we can then share the data. So we can actually do the stuff that we are advocating is necessary in order to get funding for phase 3. And I've just punted in there an example of something that we have got that we would love to be involved in a project like this. This is a recently rediscovered collection of brass rubbings that were actually made back in the 1870s and have been literally sitting in an oak chest since they were given to the museum in 1934. They're important because they preserve images of brasses that have long since disappeared from Kent churches, and as you can see on the left there, some of them are quite fragmentary and they desperately need conserving if they're going to be shared with a wider audience themselves. And it will be really, really exciting to work with a group of young people and a conservator to look at these, analyze them, log the data, and share that kind of data around the consortium. So thanks very much for listening.